In your career as a domestic terrorist special agent, how did you constitutionally prevent attacks?
You know, actually, it was interesting because the rules that I worked under were basically the rules that were put in place after the FBI's abuse during the COINTELPRO era in the 1950s and 60s, ending in the 1970s. Attorney General Levy then came out with guidelines trying to make sure that the FBI focused on its criminal justice mission by making a very simple rule that the FBI couldn't conduct investigations unless it had a reasonable indication that the subjects were involved in criminal activity, either currently or in the future. So it was pretty easy sort of line to create where I trained young agents. And you know, there was always sort of pushback on whether reasonable suspicion was met. But I would say to them, you know, if you can't sit down and on a piece of paper write down why you think it's worthy of your time to investigate this person and how it would lead to an ultimate prosecution, there's probably a lot of other bad people out there to be investigating. You know, there's no shortage of crime in the United States.
Right.
And it was a standard that I think worked very well. We were able to identify a number of criminal acts that had taken place. We had identified a number of organizations that were small groups of individuals that were close to that criminal activity, and we had the reasonable suspicion they had been involved in it and were planning future acts of terrorism focused on the people who were actually engaging in criminal activity rather than those who were coming to a lot of these meetings, whether it was neo-Nazi groups or militia groups, just to express themselves. I mean, you know, as abhorrent as neo-Nazi beliefs can be, our system allows people to hold those beliefs and to express them. And I found it was actually very easy for me to distinguish between the people who were talking about things I didn't like and people who were actually doing bad things. And having that guideline actually helped me become more effective by focusing the investigation and all my efforts on people who were actually doing bad things. And then on the backside of it, after we identified the criminals, collected the evidence necessary to convict them, and brought them to trial, in one of the militia groups, there were a number of supporters, militia-type supporters, that appeared at the trial, and they were there throughout a 6-week trial, so they were there a long time. And at the end, one of them came over to me and shook my hand and said, "You did the right thing here. I sat through the trial, I saw the evidence, these people were going to hurt somebody, and your work prevented that. If they had hurt somebody, it would have hurt my movement, so I appreciate what you did." Now, this is somebody who's in an anti-government militia, shaking the hand of a government infiltrator.
Right.
But because our system is so transparent, and he was able to witness the trial, you know, seeing the evidence, seeing the challenges that the defense lawyers made, he determined that it was fair and that these people actually had done wrong. And that is really where victory over terrorism is most important, where you're actually changing the minds of people who otherwise would have been against you. And that's what I think we sacrificed in the so-called war on terrorism, is that we took all the strongest parts of our system and threw them away, and
Right.
instead used the methods that petty dictatorships use. And you know, the response is that, you know, terrorism has increased around the world because we abandoned the rule of law.
Right. And along those lines, isn't it true that over 85% of Guantanamo Bay detainees were either turned in by Afghan or Pakistani citizens who were given a reward for their arrest? What kind of
Right.
Credible evidence are we seeing in those cases?
Very little. I mean, I don't think they even plan on trying the vast majority of the people that are down there. And it's very clear, even the government acknowledges that many of the people are completely innocent. We're never enemies of the United States, and we're picked up by accident or through, like you said, somebody selling somebody to the U.S. government. And, you know, I think in a lot of the discussion where people talk about the individuals down there, they call them the terrorists, you know, going back into that theme that, you know, these were the worst of the worst.
Right.
When in fact, there's no evidence to do that. And particularly where they talk about the difficulty of trying them, you know, that, oh, no, we can't put these people in U.S. courts because if the evidence isn't there to prosecute them, you know, then we would have to release them. Well, clearly, if the evidence isn't there to prosecute them, that indicates that they're innocent. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot in our system where somebody is guilty to prove that they're guilty. You know, and that's what policemen and FBI agents have been doing, you know, since there's been an FBI.
Right.
And yet there's this sort of assumption that they're guilty because they're there, when that simply isn't true. And as you said, most of them were not battlefield captures by U.S. forces at all, far from it.
Right.
They were either far from the battlefield or not even captured by U.S. authorities. So, you know, the fact that the government has so little evidence doesn't indicate that it's difficult to gather evidence against guilty people. It indicates that it's easy to lock up innocent people when you aren't requiring evidence.
Exactly, especially with these military tribunals, it's even...
Right, and you know, when you water down the system, as the military commissions do, the quality of the evidence that needs to be there, we have to remember that these rules of evidence we have in our criminal justice system weren't just invented by crafty lawyers to make it hard to convict people. They were actually crafted through hundreds of years of jurisprudence where courts were trying to get to, how do we know evidence is reliable? You know, if somebody will say something out of court but won't come into court to say it, that gives you an indication that perhaps that out-of-court statement isn't reliable, because they won't say it when they're under oath in court. You know, that's why we ban hearsay. You know, that we want the best evidence to make sure that we're using information that's actually tested, so that we get the truth in the end. Where when you water down those systems, it makes it less likely you're going to get to the truth, and more likely rumor, innuendo, guilt by association are going to play into improperly putting an innocent person in jail.
And tell us about some of the children being held at Guantanamo Bay.
Well, there were children as young as 13 that were put down there. There was one who was 15 who is being considered for prosecution. And, you know, international conventions are clear that child soldiers should not be treated as criminals, that they need to be treated as children who need rehabilitation. And our system down there has simply ignored that standard procedure around the world, and it's, you know, I mean, it just reflects so poorly on us that we would put children in a situation where they're put in a situation no adult should be in, you know, down there in Guantanamo. And again, just shows that we've completely abandoned the values that we profess around the world.
Does the ACLU have any civil libertarians who oppose Obama because of his record on authorizing wiretapping?
Well, certainly if you look at the criticism that the ACLU has been producing over the last 3 months, you know, we're probably one of the most vocal critics of the administration, where the administration has tended to not live up to its campaign promises. You know, certainly there were some things that they did that we agreed with. The transparency agenda that they proclaimed the first day of their administration was something that we thought would really help. You know, the problem is they haven't quite lived up to that, and in so many areas have either adopted the previous administration's position on certain things like state secrets, or you know, whether when Guantanamo will close, you know, it was nice to hear that torture would be abandoned as a technique used by any U.S. forces, but it's unclear whether that directive is actually having an effect on the ground.
Right.
And now that, you know, military commissions are being reinstituted, you know, we have real concerns. And, you know, while we recognize that it's difficult to turn a very big ship around very quickly, I think it's very important to have the transparency that the administration said it would hold itself to. And, you know, the photographs are the perfect example of, you know, not living up to that promise.
Right.